They thought he was just another man, without a voice, powerless, against a system built to silence him. But when Derek Langston stepped into that courtroom armed with truth and unbreakable resolve, he didn't just fight back. He exposed a fraud that left the judge stunned and an entire community forever changed. Stay with us as we unravel the story they never saw coming. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. Derek Langston had always known the weight of silence. He had learned it as a child, sitting at his grandmother's kitchen table in Birmingham, Alabama, watching her scribble figures into a battered ledger by the flicker of a single lamp. He had learned it as a teenager, listening to her quiet hum of gospel melodies, while bills piled up around them like walls tightening in. But most of all, he had learned it the day she collapsed in that same kitchen, clutching her chest as the unpaid notices on the counter trembled with her. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that screams in the pit of your stomach, echoing with every wrong turn the world seems determined to take. Now standing in the fluorescent glare of the Fulton County Courthouse, Derek carried that silence like armor. His suit was borrowed slightly too large, the cuffs fraying just enough to be noticed, and his tie hung a fraction off center. His hands were steady, though, as he smoothed the folder under his arm and lifted his chin. The courtroom was already murmuring the kind of low, knowing buzz that crackles through the air when an underdog steps into a ring built for giants. He felt every eye on him, most barely concealing their skepticism. After all, what chance did a man like Derek Black, unrepresented by counsel, with no formal legal training, have against the steel machinery of a corporate legal team? At the front of the room sat Judge Lawrence Carmichael, a man known for his impatience and his thinly veiled amusement at self-represented litigants. His spectacles perched low on his nose as he skimmed the docket, already half dismissive. "Mr. Langston," he said, drawing the name out like it was a joke only he understood. "Representing yourself today?" Derek met his gaze squarely. "Yes, Your Honor." A smirk played at the corners of Carmichael's mouth. "Very well. Let's proceed." Seated at the opposing table, Christopher Hale, a senior partner from one of the most formidable real estate law firms in Atlanta, barely concealed his own smirk. His tailored suit seemed to absorb the courtroom light as though it were woven from the very threads of authority and privilege. He leaned toward his assistant, murmuring something just loud enough for Derek to catch. "This'll be over before lunch." Derek heard the words. He was meant to. It was the same kind of dismissal he had faced when he tried to speak to the mortgage officer when he'd called the bank's customer service line only to be transferred into oblivion when the eviction notice arrived, as though written in stone. But he didn't flinch. His face remained composed, his mind razor sharp. Let them think this was easy. Let them think he was beaten before he even spoke. The truth was, Derek Langston had been preparing for this moment for months, long nights of poring over legal statutes and property records, hours spent in public libraries and community legal clinics, absorbing knowledge like a sponge fueled by the quiet fury of a man who refused to let his grandmother's home be stolen from under him. As the bailiff called the room to order, Derek felt his pulse steady the weight of the courtroom pressing down like a hand on his shoulder. But instead of buckling, he straightened. This was more than a fight over property. It was about dignity. It was about the unspoken message that people like him were meant to lose, meant to surrender before they even began. He wasn't here to play by their script. He was here to rewrite it. Mr. Hale, the judge, prompted, nodding toward the sleek figure at the prosecution's table. "You may proceed." Hale rose. His voice, smooth, confident, polished. He spoke of contracts and deadlines, of Derek's supposed negligence, of the bank's unquestionable right to reclaim the property. It was a performance, as much as it was an argument, every word carefully placed to tighten the noose. And yet, as Hale spoke, something shifted in the room. It wasn't what he was saying. It was the way Derek stood silent, his eyes unwavering, his presence unsettling in its calm. The quiet was no longer the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a storm gathering strength just beyond the horizon. When Hale concluded, the judge turned back to Derek, a hint of boredom in his tone. "Mr. Langston, your response." Derek stepped forward, his hands steady, his voice measured, but carrying through the room with surprising clarity. "Your Honor." He began, his gaze sweeping briefly over the gallery, where a few faces had turned from amused to curious. "This isn't just about a contract. It's about a system built to ensure that voices like mine are drowned out by paperwork and protocol." The judge's smirk faltered just slightly. "I intend to show that the foreclosure was based on manipulated documents and procedural misconduct." Derek continued unfolding the first sheet of his carefully prepared evidence. "I will demonstrate that the signatures on the mortgage were inconsistent, that the transfer of ownership was never properly recorded, and that the actions taken by the plaintiff were not only unethical, but illegal." A ripple of surprise ran through the courtroom. Even Hale's confident posture tightened, his smirk freezing for a split second before he recovered. This wasn't the meek, clueless man he had expected. This was someone who had done his homework, someone who wasn't afraid to stand alone in a room designed to make him feel small. Derek's voice, calm but resolute, filled the space between the polished walls. "I may not have a law degree, but I have the truth. And today, I'll prove it." The room held its breath. Even the judge, for all his condescension, leaned forward slightly, his fingers no longer tapping idly against the bench. What had begun as an almost laughable case was shifting into something else entirely. A battle not just of contracts and signatures, but of resilience against a system that had underestimated the wrong man. And in that moment, as Derek Langston stood poised with the quiet strength of a man who refused to be dismissed, the entire courtroom realized they were about to witness far more than a simple property dispute. They were about to witness a reckoning. The courtroom settled into a tense silence as Derek Langston straightened his shoulders and took a measured breath. The soft shuffling of papers and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights faded into the background, replaced by a palpable stillness. The air seemed thicker now, heavy with the weight of expectations. This wasn't just a routine property dispute anymore. It was the beginning of something much larger, and everyone in the room could sense it. Judge Lawrence Carmichael leaned forward slightly, his expression tightening, the smirk from earlier, now replaced by something more neutral. He tapped his gavel, once the sound sharp in the quiet room. "Mr. Langston, you may proceed." Derek's steps were steady as he approached the podium. His voice, though not loud, carried a clarity and purpose that commanded attention. "Your Honor, I will demonstrate that the foreclosure on my grandmother's home was not only based on incomplete records, but that it relied on signatures that don't align with verified legal documentation. A low murmur spread through the courtroom. Christopher Hale, seated across from Derek, adjusted his cufflinks, his earlier smirk replaced by a tight line of his lips. His assistant whispered something to him, but for the first time, Hale didn't respond. He watched Derek with narrowed eyes, trying to reassess the man he'd dismissed as irrelevant. Derek held up two documents for the court. Here we have two versions of the mortgage contract for the property at issue. One is from the original filing, and the other is from a modification made just 3 months later. If you look closely, he walked toward the bailiff. Offering the documents, you'll see that the signatures don't match. Not just in style, but in fundamental structure. This second signature couldn't have been written by my grandmother, Eleanor Langston. The bailiff handed the papers to Judge Carmichael, who adjusted his glasses and examined them with a deepening frown. Derek continued, his voice unwavering, "And I have evidence to support this claim. During the time the second signature was dated, my grandmother was recovering from a debilitating stroke in the hospital. She couldn't have signed anything." The murmurs grew louder, now punctuated by a few gasps from observers. Derek didn't pause. He drew another paper from his folder. "Furthermore, I have a notarized affidavit from her attending physician, Dr. Angela Pierce, confirming her hospitalization during that period." Hale shot to his feet, his voice sharp and dismissive. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We haven't been given time to review these claims." Judge Carmichael silenced him with a raised hand. "Mr. Hale, you'll have ample time to cross-examine. Sit down." Reluctantly, Hale complied, his jaw tight as he sat. Derek pressed forward. "This isn't just about one signature. The deeper I looked, the more discrepancies I found. The transfer of mortgage ownership between the banks was conducted without proper endorsements. The documentation trail is incomplete. There's no legitimate chain of custody for the mortgage itself. In essence, the bank pursuing this foreclosure had no legal standing to do so." Judge Carmichael's brows knitted, his fingers drumming the bench, an unspoken question forming in his mind. Derek preempted it. "I understand this may seem unusual, Your Honor, for someone like me to uncover these details. But I've spent months reviewing every piece of documentation, every statute, and every relevant case precedent, and I'm prepared to provide evidence and witnesses to support every claim I make." Hale, now visibly agitated, stood again. "Objection, Your Honor. This is grandstanding. Mr. Langston has no legal expertise, no standing to argue this." But Carmichael's voice cut through sharper than before. "Mr. Hale, sit down." For the first time since the proceedings had begun, the judge's tone carried an edge of respect, not for Hale, but for Derek. Derek's unwavering calm, his methodical presentation, was eroding the narrative that Hale's team had prepared so carefully. The courtroom, once dismissive of Derek's presence, now leaned forward, drawn into the unfolding drama. "I'd like to call a witness," Derek said, and his words landed with the weight of a hammer. "I've located Linda Myers, the notary who allegedly certified the second mortgage modification." A ripple ran through the room. Hale's face paled, and he whispered frantically to his assistant. Judge Carmichael gestured for the bailiff to summon the witness. Moments later, the door at the back of the courtroom opened, and Linda Myers stepped through. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached the stand adjusting her glasses with a nervous motion. She was a middle-aged woman in a conservative blazer, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. Derek approached his tone respectful but firm. Ms. Myers, do you recall notarizing the second mortgage document for Eleanor Langston? Linda hesitated, glancing at Hale's table before answering. Yes, I do. Were you present when she signed it? Her voice wavered, but she found her resolve. No, I wasn't. I was handed the document by a bank representative and told it had already been signed. A gasp swept through the courtroom. Hale jumped to his feet. Objection. Hearsay. Overruled. Judge Carmichael said, his voice sharper now. Continue, Mr. Langston. Derek nodded his thanks and pressed on. Ms. Myers, did you verify the authenticity of the signature before notarizing it? I didn't. I was told it was a routine matter. The courtroom buzzed louder. Derek turned to the judge, his voice low but resonant. Your Honor, this testimony demonstrates that not only was the signature invalid, but that the foreclosure process was initiated on a fraudulent basis. I request full discovery of all records pertaining to this case and the immediate suspension of the foreclosure order. Judge Carmichael looked down at the papers, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice carrying a weight that made the room hold its breath. Request for full discovery is granted. The foreclosure order is hereby suspended pending further review. Derek felt the weight of the moment settle over him. It wasn't victory yet, but it was the first crack in the fortress he had been battering against. The opening salvo had been fired, and for the first time the courtroom realized that the man they had underestimated was, in fact, the one holding all the cards. The sun had barely broken over the horizon the next morning when Derek Langston found himself sitting alone in his modest kitchen, sipping a cup of bitter coffee. The events of the courtroom played in his mind like a loop, each word, each moment, replaying itself with renewed clarity. The discovery of the fraudulent notarization wasn't just a win, it was the tip of something much larger, something darker. The fight was far from over, and Derek knew that the truth he had begun to unravel was more complex and dangerous than anyone in that courtroom had dared to imagine. He stared at the stack of documents scattered across the table papers he had pored over for months. Now, with the court granting him full discovery, he had access to the internal records of the bank that had claimed his grandmother's home. It wasn't just about one signature or one property. As he flipped through files, cross-referencing dates, names, and transaction histories, a pattern emerged. Each document whispered a story of quiet theft families losing homes through a calculated system of fabricated paperwork and conveniently lost records. Derek's fingers tightened around a printout showing a string of mortgage transfers, each one accompanied by missing endorsements or irregularities. It was clear now. The bank hadn't just mishandled his grandmother's case. They had been playing the same game with countless others, betting on the fact that most people wouldn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. But Derek was different. His determination was no longer fueled by personal loss alone. It was driven by the faces of those families, by the idea that someone needed to stand against this faceless machine of greed. By midday, Derek sat across from Linda Myers in a quiet corner of a small cafe, away from prying eyes and ears. Her hands trembled as she wrapped them around her coffee cup, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know. She said again, her guilt raw and unfiltered. They told me it was routine, just paperwork. Derek's voice was low but steady. Routine doesn't mean right, Linda. and it doesn't absolve them of what they did, or you of the part you played. But what matters now is that you're willing to help set things right. She nodded, her eyes glistening. What do you need from me? I need you to testify. I need you to provide a detailed statement about how they instructed you to notarize those documents without verification. And if you know of any others who were coerced or misled, now is the time to come forward. For a moment, Linda hesitated, but then she nodded with renewed resolve. I'll do it. As she left, Derek felt a weight lift from his shoulders, only to be replaced by a heavier burden, the responsibility of exposing a system that was more corrupt and more deeply entrenched than he had anticipated. Back at his apartment, he dived back into the discovery files, piecing together the bank's web of deceit. Each transfer form, each notarized signature, each missing endorsement was a thread in the tapestry of corruption. Slowly, meticulously, he compiled a timeline of fraudulent activities spanning years affecting not just his grandmother, but dozens of other homeowners. He reached out to a local journalist, Vanessa Cole, known for her fearless investigative reporting. When they met in a dimly lit corner of a public library, Vanessa listened intently, her pen flying across her notebook as Derek laid out the evidence. This isn't just a case of one bank cutting corners, Derek said, his voice taut with controlled anger. It's systemic. They're profiting off the vulnerability of people who don't know how to fight back. Vanessa's eyes narrowed with determination. I'll dig into it. But you'll need more than paperwork to blow this wide open. You'll need witnesses, people who are willing to stand with you. I'm working on that, Derek replied. I've already found a few willing to speak up. They're scared, but they're tired of being ignored. They spent hours poring over the files, Vanessa noting potential leads, contacts, and points of pressure. The next few days were a blur of interviews, late-night calls, and quiet meetings in hidden corners of the city. Vanessa's stories began surfacing online, each one pulling back another layer of the bank's facade. Whispers of legal inquiries began circulating, and Derek's phone buzzed with messages from strangers' families who had seen the reports and were ready to share their own experiences. The momentum was building, but Derek knew it wasn't enough. He needed to confront Christopher Hale directly. He needed to look the man in the eye and make him realize that the system he thought was unshakable was beginning to fracture. He arranged a meeting under the guise of a settlement discussion, and when Hale walked into the downtown office building's conference room, Derek was ready. Hale's usual arrogance was replaced by thinly veiled hostility. You think you've made some big discovery, he sneered. You're just a man with a stack of papers and a lot of noise. Derek's response was calm but razor sharp. No, Mr. Hale. I'm a man with the truth, and soon you'll have to answer to more than just me. He laid out the evidence, notarized statements, medical records, internal emails from the bank showing deliberate obfuscation of records, and most damning of all, video recordings from whistleblowers who had come forward. Hale's face turned a sickly pale as he realized the scope of what was unfolding. You're bluffing, he said weakly. Am I? Derek's voice was ice. I'll be seeing you in court. But this time you won't be smirking. As Derek walked away, leaving Hale to stew in his growing fear, he felt a surge of quiet triumph. The truth was out now, and it was rippling beyond the courtroom walls. The man they had underestimated was no longer just a lone voice against a machine. He was the spearhead of a movement demanding justice. And there was no turning back. The courthouse was unusually quiet on the morning of Derek Langston's return. Word had spread whispers snaking through corridors and seeping into offices. There was a hushed anticipation in the air, a waiting silence that felt almost reverent. Derek stepped through the heavy wooden doors, his footsteps echoing softly as he moved toward the same courtroom where he had once stood, alone, underestimated, and dismissed. Today, however, he was not alone. Journalists filled the benches, their cameras poised like sentinels ready to capture every word. Community members, drawn by the unfolding story of a man challenging a system that had wronged so many, lined the walls, their faces etched with quiet hope and determination. Judge Walter Grayson presided from the bench, his expression guarded but watchful. He had seen the shift, had read the growing number of affidavits and statements flooding into his chambers over the past weeks. He knew that the case of Derek Langston versus the bank was no longer a simple property dispute. It was a test of the very fabric of justice. Opposite Derek sat Christopher Hale, his carefully crafted composure cracking at the edges. His legal team, once smug and confident, now whispered hurriedly among themselves, their stacks of paperwork looking less like weapons and more like brittle shields. For the first time, Derek saw fear in their eyes, not of him, but of the truth he carried. As the session opened, Derek stood to deliver his argument, his voice clear and resonant. Your Honor, today isn't about one family's home. It's about a pattern of deception, a deliberate scheme to exploit the powerless. I've presented evidence of forged signatures, missing transfer endorsements, and coerced notarizations. But beyond the paperwork are the voices of those who were silenced, the families who lost everything because they believed they had no recourse. Today, we give them a voice. He turned and gestured toward the gallery where several families, men, women, children, stood, each one a living testament to the damage wrought by corruption. Their presence was a silent indictment, a human face to the sterile numbers and legal jargon. Judge Grayson's gaze shifted, his eyes settling on each witness, reading the weight of their quiet, steadfast support. Mr. Hale, he said, his tone measured but firm. Do you have a response? Hale's lawyer rose, his voice brittle with forced confidence. Your Honor, we maintain that our client has operated within the bounds of the law. The evidence presented is circumstantial, based on incomplete records and the unsubstantiated claims of disgruntled individuals. Derek's lips twitched in a subtle smile. Circumstantial. He pulled a document from his folder, handing it to the bailiff. This, Your Honor, is a complete chain of communication from within the bank, outlining explicit instructions to obscure transfer records and expedite foreclosures on properties without proper legal authority. It's signed by Mr. Hale himself. A ripple of shock coursed through the room. The judge's eyebrows arched as he scanned the document, his lips pressing into a thin line. Derek continued, his voice gaining strength. In addition to this, we have sworn statements from multiple former employees corroborating these practices and recorded interviews detailing how homeowners were misled or intimidated into surrendering their rights. Hale's lawyer stammered, but the momentum had shifted irrevocably. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his voice low and decisive. This is no longer a question of legal technicalities. This is a question of ethics, of responsibility, of justice. Mr. Langston, I'm authorizing a full investigation into these practices. I'm also suspending foreclosure proceedings, not just on your family's home, but on any property tied to the fraudulent actions brought to light today. The courtroom erupted into quiet murmurs, a collective exhale of long-held breath. Derek felt the weight in his chest lighten, not because the fight was over, but because the truth had finally been acknowledged. As he stood there surrounded by the quiet dignity of those he represented, he felt a swell of something deeper than vindication resolve. This wasn't the end. It was a turning point, a crack in the facade of unchecked power. Christopher Hale sat motionless, his face pale, the weight of exposure settling on his shoulders. He was no longer the man in control, but a symbol of a system that had long thrived on silence and fear. The reporters filed out of the courtroom, their pens scratching furiously, capturing the moment when a quiet, determined man stood against an empire and made it tremble. Outside, the air was crisp, the sun breaking through the clouds in pale gold streaks. Derek stood on the steps surrounded by those who had come to witness justice begin its slow, relentless march forward. A woman approached him, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you for standing up for us," she said, her hand trembling as it clasped his. Derek met her gaze, his voice gentle. "This is just the beginning," he said. "But together we'll make sure it's a beginning that counts." As the crowd dispersed, Derek felt the chill of the autumn wind against his face, but he welcomed it. It was the wind of change, and he was ready to stand in its path. The days following the courtroom revelation were a whirlwind of media headlines, legal filings, and whispered conversations in the hallways of city offices. Yet, amid the storm of public attention, Derek Langston found himself drawn not to the spectacle, but to the quiet moments that marked real change. He returned to his grandmother's home, now no longer under threat, and stood on the creaking porch, feeling the weight of history beneath his feet. The chipped paint and worn wood seemed almost like scars, visible reminders of a fight that was far from over, but had turned irrevocably in his favor. Inside, sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars. Derek's grandmother Alma sat in her favorite armchair, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes soft with pride and weariness. "You didn't just fight for me," she said quietly, her voice a gentle tremor. "You fought for everyone who's been told they don't matter." Derek knelt beside her, his voice low but steady. "I couldn't let them steal what was ours. Not just the house, but our dignity." In the weeks that followed, Derek threw himself into building something lasting. He organized community meetings in the local library, inviting families who had faced similar injustices to share their stories. The gatherings were small, at first hesitant, but soon the room filled with voices, some trembling, some fiery, all united by the shared experience of being dismissed by a system that was supposed to protect them. He collaborated with local activists and attorneys, forming a coalition dedicated to property rights advocacy and legal education. They created workshops, teaching residents how to read mortgage documents, how to identify predatory lending practices, and how to navigate the complexities of property law. Derek's own experience became the blueprint, his story a testament to the power of knowledge and perseverance. As his name became more recognized, Derek was invited to speak at regional conferences, his words resonating with audiences far beyond his neighborhood. He shared not just the technicalities of his legal victory, but the emotional toll of fighting a system designed to exhaust and discourage. His speeches were punctuated by moments of reflection, of honoring those who had fought before him, and those who still faced barriers he could now help dismantle. One crisp morning, standing before a packed auditorium at Georgia State University, Derek looked out over the crowd, students, professors, community leaders, and families. his voice carried with a calm conviction. "This isn't just about one case, one family's home," he said. "It's about standing up when the odds are stacked against you. It's about knowing that the law, though imperfect, can be a tool for justice if we're willing to learn it, to challenge it, and to use it." After the applause faded, a young woman approached him. Her hands trembled slightly as she held out a notebook. "I've been afraid to speak up," she said, her voice barely audible. "But your story, it gives me hope." Derek took the notebook, his expression kind. "Your voice matters," he said softly. "Never let anyone tell you otherwise." As the season shifted and the media attention gradually faded, Derek's work continued. The coalition grew stronger, their advocacy more organized and impactful. They partnered with national organizations, drawing resources and expertise to support their efforts. The quiet, determined man, who had once stood alone in a courtroom, was now a leader of a movement, a symbol of what could happen when courage met preparation. At the end of each day, Derek returned to Alma's house, sitting on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. He would watch the neighborhood settle into twilight, the hum of conversations and the laughter of children filling the air. In those moments, he felt not just the satisfaction of victory, but the deeper fulfillment of purpose. He knew the work was far from over. There would always be new battles, new obstacles, but Derek Langston had proven to the world, to his community, and to himself that the underestimated could not only rise, but lead. And as the night deepened around him, he smiled softly, ready for whatever would come next. It was a new chapter, and this time he was writing it on his own terms. Derek Langston's story is a profound testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of knowledge and determination. What began as a man fighting a seemingly unwinnable battle against a corporate behemoth intent on seizing his grandmother's home turned into a broader, more meaningful crusade. His journey was not just about defending property, but about defending dignity, community, and the right to be heard. Derek stood tall in a courtroom that had already dismissed him, faced a judge whose skepticism was palpable, and went up against a legal team armed with resources and arrogance. But through meticulous research, unwavering resolve, and a quiet, unbreakable spirit, Derek turned the tables on those who underestimated him. The courtroom, once a place where Derek was seen as an underdog, became the stage where he exposed a web of legal fraud and misconduct. His victory was not marked by dramatic outbursts or grandiose speeches, but by the undeniable weight of truth and evidence. The very system designed to silence him was forced to acknowledge its failures, and in doing so, it became a platform for justice, not just for Derek and his grandmother, but for countless others trapped in similar circumstances. Yet Derek's story did not end with a gavel's final strike. Instead of retreating into quiet satisfaction, he chose to channel his experience into action. He built networks, educated his community, and became a symbol of hope and resilience. He showed that justice is not a solitary achievement, but a collective responsibility. His ability to transform personal struggle into communal empowerment is a lesson for us all. The key takeaway from Derek Langston's journey is that real change often starts from the most unlikely places. It begins when one person decides to stand up to question the status quo and to refuse to be silenced. It teaches us that while the path to justice may be fraught with obstacles, courage paired with preparation can dismantle even the most entrenched systems of power. Derek's story reminds us that we do not need to be legal experts or public figures to make a difference. We only need the willingness to learn to stand firm and to speak out for what is right. In today's world, where many face barriers to justice and equality, Derek's experience serves as both a beacon and a call to action. It encourages us to educate ourselves, to support those fighting for their rights, and to recognize the power of community in effecting change. Whether it's helping a neighbor understand their rights, challenging unfair practices in our workplaces, or simply being willing to listen and support, we each have a role to play. If Derek's story resonated with you, if it inspired you to see the potential within yourself and your community, we invite you to subscribe to this channel. Your support allows us to continue sharing stories that matter, stories that challenge, uplift, and remind us all that the fight for justice is far from over. Together, let's keep these conversations alive and push for a world where every voice is heard and every person has the power to make a difference. Join us because the next chapter is waiting to be written.